Okay, and we are live. Just going to reintroduce myself. I'm Cynthia Rutz, and this is the second half of the basic program first year class in the winter semester. We are reading Aristotle's Ethics, and the assignment for today was the first book of the Ethics. So that's where we are. So remind me a little bit what you talked about last week. I assume you started at the beginning and talked about the good as the aim of action and about politics as the science of the good for man. I'm guessing that probably was a bit of a surprise to some of you. Politics as the science of the highest good for man.
At least to me.
Uh-huh. It helps if you keep in mind what our footnote says, which is it's not just politics, it's civilization. Right. You know, that for them they didn't have a separate word for society. So where we hear politics, we should also hear society, community. You know, and he's saying that if you're looking for the good of man, you have to seek it in community, not in, an individual person. And did you talk a bit about happiness last week?
We got through about the first four.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Areas.
Wow. Okay. So you did talk about happiness as the good, and possibly the highest good.
Can I ask a general question?
Yes.
I have all kinds of preconceptions probably about ethics that are entirely sort of my own upbringing and what I've read and what I know. It seems to me that ethics is highly circumscribed as Aristotle sees it, and that it's really ethics for citizens who are adult and well educated. Is that on target?
Well, he hasn't limited it yet, right? When you say citizens, so you're going back to the Meno and asking, is ethics the same for a woman, for a slave, for a man? Those are the kind of questions you're thinking about. And those certainly are some of the questions that Plato thought about. At the moment, Aristotle isn't thinking about that. And when we get to his definition of happiness, I think that's a question we should ask ourselves. Is this a definition that only works if you are a male aristocrat living in Athens? Or is this a definition that fits any time and any gender and any position in society? I think that's a really good question to ask ourselves when we get to that definition.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's go ahead and dive in. Since you read sections 1 through 4, I mean, you've read the whole book. You looked in detail at sections 1 through 4. I'm going to, for now, skip the next couple of sections because he does a thing Aristotle likes to do a lot, which is instead of telling you what he thinks, he says, so what do people generally think about this? What's the scuttlebutt out there about happiness and what it means and who's happy and who's not? And he goes into that in section 5. And then in section 6, he feels like he needs to deal at length with Plato's ideas about the good, some of which might have seemed familiar to you from the Meno. But we don't really get to his take until section 7. And that's where I want to jump in, and we can go back and look at what others have said. But I want to focus on 7 because that's where he gives his definition of happiness, or at least of the good of man. So let's start at the beginning of 7. If you have a different translation, it's at 1097a15. And it starts out, let us return again. James, would you be willing to pick up right there?
Sure. Let us return again to our investigation into the nature of the good which we are seeking. It is evidently something different in different actions and in each art. It is one thing in medicine, another in strategy, and another again in each of the other arts. What then is the good of each? Is it not that for the sake of which everything else is done? That means it is health in the case of medicine, victory in the case of strategy, a house in the case of building, a different thing in the case of different arts, and in all actions and choices, it is the end. For it is for the sake of the end that all else is done. Thus, if there is some one end for all that we do, this would be the good attainable by action. If there are several ends, they will be the goods attainable by action. Our argument has gradually progressed to the same point at which we were before, and we must try to clarify it still further. Since there are evidently several ends, and since we choose some of these, for example, wealth, flutes, and instruments generally, as a means to something else, it is obvious that not all ends are final. The highest good, on the other hand, must be something final. Thus, if there is only one final end, this will be the good we are seeking. If there are several, it will be the most final and perfect of them. We call that which is pursued as an end in itself more final than an end which is pursued for the sake of something else. And what is never chosen as a means to something else, we call more final than that which is chosen both as an end in itself and as a means to something else. What is always chosen as an end in itself and never as a means to something else is called final in an unqualified sense. This description seems to apply to happiness above all else, for we always choose happiness as an end in itself and never for the sake of something else. Honor, pleasure, intelligence, and all virtue we choose partly for themselves. For we would choose each of them even if no further advantage would accrue from them, but we also choose them partly for the sake of happiness because we assume that it is through them that we will be happy. On the other hand, no one chooses happiness for the sake of honor, pleasure, and the like, nor as a means to anything at all.
Okay, let's stop and talk about that and see if we really think that's true. So he talks about choices we make. You know, we see people all around us and ourselves choosing to spend time in pleasure, spend time learning, do things to try to get honored. And he says, we choose these things for themselves, but behind them all is happiness. That what we're really choosing these things for is because we want to be happy. Do we think that's really true? That the bottom of everything is happiness. That's why we do what we do, why we choose what we choose.
I would say yes. So our definition of our word happiness may vary, but it could be construed happiness is too flimsy, too superficial. But I think we generally try to be happy in life. Whether it's just content, whatever your definition may be.
Okay. Yeah.
I can certainly see how hard it would be to say, I want to be happy so that I can be a good flute player.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. The reverse, you can see that. Why do you want to be a good flute player? Because I want to be the best. Why do you want to be the best? And his claim is that you ask enough questions, and like, because that's what would make me happy. Yeah. And you're saying, but you can't imagine someone saying, I want to be, say it the way you said it again, Norm.
Yeah. I want to be happy so I can be a good flute player.
Okay, yeah.
Although our university jazz band was down at a conference in New Orleans and got critiqued afterwards, as I just heard today. Mm-hmm. And the big deal from one of the big universities came in and said of our group, he says, I have never seen a group play with so much joy.
Okay.
So they're getting their happiness out of playing.
Okay. Yes.
And I know these kids, so I can back it up.
Okay. So somehow all roads lead to happiness, but happiness does not lead to something else. Yeah. I want to be happy so that I can do X. It's going to always go the other way. I want to do X so I can be happy. Yeah. Okay, so if we're looking for the good, the reason we do things, his claim is at the bottom is happiness. But as James pointed out, what do we mean by happiness? We use the word, but what do we mean? So then he gets a little deeper with it. So let's pick it up there. Paul, would you read the very next paragraph, starting with we arrive? You'll need to put your microphone on. Oh,
Okay.
yeah, you go.
Okay. We arrive at the same conclusion if we approach the question from the standpoint of self-sufficiency. For the final and perfect good seems to be self-sufficient. However, we define something as self-sufficient not by reference to the self alone. We do not mean a man who lives his life in isolation, but a man who also lives with parents, children, a wife, and friends and fellow citizens generally, since man is by nature a social and political being. But some limit must be set to these relationships, for if they are extended to include ancestors, descendants, and friends of friends, they will go on to infinity. However, this point must be reserved for investigation later. For the present, we define as self-sufficient that which taken by itself makes life something desirable and deficient in nothing. It is happiness, in our opinion, which fits this description. Moreover, happiness of all things the one most desirable, and is not counted as one good thing among many others. But if it were counted as one among others, it is obvious that the addition of even the least of the goods would make it more desirable, for the addition would produce an extra amount of good, and the greater amount of good is always more desirable than the lesser. We see then that happiness is something final and self-sufficient in the end of our actions.
Okay, so sorry, I'm going to pause you there. So he goes back and says, let's take a different road. So the first road we took is, what's at the bottom of all the things we choose? If you keep asking enough questions, what are you going to hear most people say that they're choosing these things for? Now he says, what is the perfect good should be self-sufficient in some way, and that too leads us to the idea that it's happiness. What's self-sufficient about happiness? And why does he want to take this new tack?
Essentially, what good in itself, it's enough in itself.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need something else. Which again sounds like an end point.
Mm-hmm.
And that's as he says, make life something desirable and deficient in nothing, and that he goes back to happiness. Yeah.
Okay. So it doesn't need anything else.
Yeah.
If you're happy, you're happy. If someone says they're happy, you don't say, well, what else do you need? I don't need anything. I'm happy. This is it.
It's a little weird that he seemed to take the self out of self-sufficient.
Yeah, he wants to make sure we don't mistake this for you don't need anyone. If you're happy, you don't need anyone.
Yeah, it becomes, I assume what he's just saying is political and not social, although it's translated as social and political.
Mm-hmm.
Might he make the argument that the notion of self encapsulates, like parents, friends, family, fellow citizens?
Mm.
And it's not our definition of self, which is, the individual and the individual only. I don't know. I'm just speculating.
Mm-hmm.
And the term, and I don't know what the Greek would be, but self-sufficient means sufficient in itself,
Mm-hmm.
not self.
So I have happiness. I don't need anything beside happiness.
Right.
But not, I have happiness, therefore I don't need other people.
Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, he says we do need other people. You'll at some point read The Politics, where he defines human beings as, like bees, social creatures. Yeah. They cannot exist alone. It's part of their nature.
Well, we got the key phrase up there that comes up again later, since man is by nature a social and political being.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an element of completeness to it? So not just sufficient by itself, but encompassing everything that you would need. So
Mm.
happy man whose activities are an expression of complete virtue.
Mm-hmm. And you're going to need parents, children, wife, friends
Yes.
for that. But he does say, but there is a limit. You don't need everybody. Like, we'll talk about it later. You need people to be happy, but how far does that go? Yeah. Well, let me ask so far Bill's question. We haven't yet got to the definition yet. Is what he says about happiness being the final goal? You choose things for it, not it for other things, and kind of self-sufficient, that when you're happy, you're done, you don't need anything else. Is that true for everybody? Is it true for poor people? Is it true for slaves? Is it true for women?
He seems to have already excluded children.
Yeah, did you talk about that in your last class?
Yes.
About, although not necessarily children, because it's not an age thing. Let's go back for a minute. So keep your place here. I want to go back to that interesting exclusion that he made back in section 4. Was it 4 or was it 3? 3. He's talking about young men, but I wonder if he means young people in general. So this is around 1095A. Maybe, Bill, since you're drawing that to our attention, would you read it there? Each man can judge.
Sure. Each man can judge competently the things he knows, and of these he is a good judge. Accordingly, a good judge in each particular field is one who has been trained in it, and a good judge in general, a man who has received an all-around schooling. For that reason, a young man is not equipped to be a student of politics, for he has no experience in the actions which life demands of him, and these actions form the basis and subject matter of the discussion. Moreover, since he follows his emotions, his study will be pointless and unprofitable, for the end of this kind of study is not knowledge, but action. Whether he is young in years or immature in character makes no difference, for his deficiency is not a matter of time, but of living and of pursuing all his interests under the influence of his emotions. Knowledge brings no benefit to this kind of person, just as it brings none to the morally weak.
Okay, let's stop there. So he's saying there's a certain kind of person that maybe that isn't smart to read this book and think about these things. And at first it sounds like he means young in years, right? So no 12-year-olds, maybe no 18-year-olds. But then it turns out he means something more like young in emotions, whether he's young in years or immature in character. So that makes it sound like you could be 60, and if you're an immature in character and ruled by your emotions, this study isn't going to do you much good. So what about that exclusion? Does that mean not everybody can be happy?
I think that's what he. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Norm.
Yeah, I'm just noting at the beginning of the passage, he's talking about students of politics. So you need the experience of living in the society to be able to understand politics and how a state functions.
Mm-hmm. Well, but also politics is the end of politics, he has said, is the good of man.
Yeah.
The good for man. So it sounds like he's saying people who are immature in character and ruled by their emotions are not going to be able to understand what is the good for man, whether they're 60 or 12.
He says you need to be able to control your emotions and act rationally. And you need training. I think it uses the term training for children. You need training and experience, and probably education to be able to he uses the term regulate your desires and act by a rational principle. And
it's going to turn out his definition of happiness involves a rational principle.
And
he
so
also,
younger people would neither have the training nor the emotional stability to do that, or an immature person will not be able to, not just children.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, I mean, the way he keeps talking about politics, it's almost, this book is trying to do the basics before you get there. Because I'm looking across the page at 1095B, where he's essentially saying, to be a competent student of what is right and just and of politics generally, one must first have received a proper upbringing in moral conduct, which sounds like maybe it's what this book is trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
You got to know this stuff first before you can do politics.
That may be. I mean, it's yeah. Is this the manual?
Yeah.
That
This is the fall quarter.
mm-hmm.
He comes back to this in chapter 9 too, where, at least in my translation, he says literally that a boy cannot be happy. Says, for we stated at the end of political science to be the best end, and political science spends most of its pains on making the citizens to be of a certain character, which is good and capable of noble acts. It is natural then that we call neither ox nor horse, nor any other of the animals happy, for none of them is capable of sharing in such activities. For this reason also a boy is not happy, for he is not yet capable of such acts owing to his age. And boys who are called happy are being congratulated by reason of the hopes we have for them. For there is required, as we said, not only complete virtue, but also a complete life, since many changes occur in life, and all manner of chances, and the most prosperous may fall into great misfortunes in old age, as is told of Priam in the Trojan cycle. And one who has experienced such chances and has ended wretchedly, no one calls happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. He jumps from, so you can't call a child happy, but he's not even sure you can call a 50-year-old happy. Because wait, let's look at the end. How did his life end? And Priam's life ended pretty horribly. So you might call Priam happy, but you might have to do it kind of provisionally. Let's see how this goes.
I mean, that's a point of a lot of the Greek drama. I'm thinking of a lot of the end comments in the plays are count no man happy until he's dead.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think either maybe in today's reading from Herodotus, did you read the Solon and Croesus interchange? Yeah, Jason's nodding.
That was last week, yeah.
Okay, so Solon, the wise man, says, I'm not going to use the word happy until I see how things turn out. So
Right.
Yeah, he was count no man happy till he's dead.
Yeah, and Priam certainly fits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's go on, and keeping in mind who might be excluded from this definition of happiness. Let's pick up back where we left off, and we're not at the definition yet. We're getting there. This is 1097 1097B25. So it's right the paragraph we left off. To call happiness the highest good. Ekagra, are you there? It sounds like you have a different translation, but
I do.
If you can do it by the numbers. So 1097B.
I don't even have numbers.
Oh, you don't have the Stephanus numbers. Too bad.
Yeah,
okay.
So,
Okay. Might be hard to follow then.
Yeah.
So Jason, do you have this one? The paragraph that begins to call happiness the highest good?
Top of page 16.
Yeah. I think so. Go ahead if you'd read it.
Sure. To call happiness the highest good is perhaps a little trite, and a clearer account of what it is still required. Perhaps this is best done by first ascertaining the proper function of man. Just as the goodness and performance of a flute player, a sculptor, or any kind of expert, and generally of anyone who fulfills some function or performs some action, are thought to reside in his proper function, though the goodness and performance of man would seem to reside in whatever is his proper function. Is it then possible that while a carpenter and a shoemaker have their own proper functions and spheres of action, man has none, but what was left by nature a good for nothing without a function? Should we not assume that just as the eye, the hand, the foot, and in general each part of the body clearly has its own proper function, so man too has some function over and above the functions of his parts? What can this function possibly be? Simply living? He shares that even with plants, but we are now looking for something peculiar to man. Accordingly, the life of nutrition and growth must be excluded. Next in line, there is a life of sense perception, but this too man has in common with the horse, the ox, and every animal. There remains then an active life of the rational element. The rational element has two parts. One is irrational in that it obeys the rule of reason, the other in that it possesses and conceives rational rules. Since the expression, life of the rational element, can also be used in two senses, we must make it clear that we mean a life determined by the activity as opposed to the mere possession of the rational element. The activity, it seems, has a greater claim to be the function of man.
Okay, let's stop there and talk about this. This is maybe a take on happiness that we're not very used to, that what we're really looking at is the proper function of man. And he gives analogies. You know, we know what the proper function of a carpenter is and the proper function of a shoemaker. So what's the overall proper function of man? And he puts out a couple things and then excludes them because he says those things we share with other creatures, other animals, and we want to, really hone in on humans. And he ends up saying it must be the rule of reason, must be an activity tied to reason. What do people think about that?
Well, he's very perceptive. I'll say that.
Mm-hmm. Or say more, Paul.
Well, he's going on a track, rational reason. And, like you said, he's making a comparison to plants and other, elements that, have their own function.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure where he's going to, but I know Akagra mentioned about the complete life, which is very intriguing, what
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle by that. So, because I think that's the cue to what happiness is, the complete life.
Mm-hmm. Well, and he's he's going to start using that term by the bottom of the next page.
Mm-hmm.
I think clearly, with Solon as an influence, that you got to think about the whole, not just a particular day.
Well, I don't know if he means physical, mental, spiritual, virtuous. I'm assuming. I haven't read all the way through here,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't know where he's going. I'm just going to make some assumptions, and that's from our last class when we studied Plato and
Mm-hmm.
Socrates, and seeing where he's taken it since he studied under Plato. But you did mention reason, which man, he's recognizing man definitely is on a higher plane than other living things.
Mm-hmm.
He also mentions activity a lot. So
Mm-hmm.
it's having the reason, it's using the reason.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost, I guess I kind of think about it as sort of an instrument, that if you're handed something, you can say, okay, what's the proper function of this thing? And it's got to be to use all the parts that are in the thing, whatever it is, whether it's a flute or a horse. And he's kind of saying humans have this thing, a brain, reason. And so if you're talking about the proper function of a human, it better involve that brain. So you can't just say, well, there's the person who's just living, they're eating, drinking, existing. He says, that's not good enough. They've got this special part, this brain. And if they're functioning properly, they need to be using that part. That's what I mean when I say it's almost sort of functional. Like you've got this big thing in the top of your head, and the proper function of a human is to use it.
It also fits in, I think, with why his view of politics, because unless there's political action, it's kind of meaningless to think of a political good.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in fact, we'll see as we go along if you feel like maybe he differs from, Plato, his master, whether he feels, part of your activity needs to be in the state. You need to be on juries. You need to be a general in the army. You need to be doing those kinds of things.
I thought that's what he was implying. I don't know if I'm right.
Yeah. And we'll see as we go along if we think that might be a difference, that people need to know you're around. They need to hear about you and your activities. You can't just be quietly philosophizing in a corner somewhere. That might not be active enough for Aristotle. Well, and again, you know, with Bill, with your question in mind, so far, that part sounds like any human. Any human has a brain, and the proper functioning of that human should be involved with using that brain and using it well. Now, what that has to do with happiness, we're about to find out. So let's pick up from there. Lauren, would you read the next paragraph?
Starting with the proper function?
The proper function, yep.
Okay, the proper function of man, then, consists in an activity of the soul in conformity with a rational principle, or at least not without it. In speaking of the proper function of a given individual, we mean it is the same in kind as the function of an individual who sets high standards for himself. The proper function of a harpist, for example, is the same as the function of a harpist who has set high standards for himself. The same applies to any and every group of individuals. The full attainment of excellence must be added to the mere function. In other words, the function of the harpist is to play the harp. The function of the harpist who has high standards is to play it well. On these assumptions, if we take the proper function of man to be a certain kind of life, and if this kind of life is an activity of the soul and consists in actions performed in conjunction with the rational element, and if a man of high standards is he who performs these actions well and properly, and if a function is well performed when it is performed in accordance with the excellence appropriate to it, we reach the conclusion that the good of man is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue, and if there are several virtues, in conformity with the best and most complete. But we must add, in a complete life. For one swallow does not make a spring, nor does one sunny day. Similarly, one day or a short time does not make a man blessed and happy. This will suffice as an outline of the good. For perhaps one ought to make a general sketch first and fill in the details afterwards.
Okay, let's stop there. So this is at least his first crack at a definition of the good of man or happiness. That it's an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue, and if there are several virtues, in conformity with the best and most complete, in a complete life. Back to that phrase.
Was there a universal understanding of what the soul was?
There was not. Each philosopher kind of defined it for himself. And you saw at the end of this chapter that he defines it as having many parts. We might want to jump a little bit, since it's part of his definition, to the last section, it's section 13. In this translation, it's called the psychological foundations of the virtues, but psychology is yet to be invented, so that's kind of our translator taking a leap there. But he talks about the different parts of the soul, maybe around 30, let's see, around the second 30, 1102b 30. If you'd read there, Lauren, this is where he describes the parts of the soul. Thus we see
that the irrational element of the soul has two parts. The one is vegetative and has no share in reason at all. The other is the seat of the appetites and of desire in general, and partakes of reason insofar as it complies with reason and accepts its leadership. It possesses reason in the sense that we say it is reasonable to accept the advice of a father and of friends, not in the sense that we have a rational understanding of mathematical propositions.
Okay, let's stop there. And then he says there's also the irrational part. So he sort of sees at least three parts. The irrational, that's made up of the vegetative, and then the desires, and then the third part, which is the rational. And given this definition that we have of the good of man, it sounds like he's saying the happy man or the good man is making use of the rational part of his soul, particularly. And from that, I think we could get that this is not quite the Christian idea of soul. Right? This is you might say our consciousness or something like that.
Is he almost saying that the plants have a vegetative soul, and and then the animals have animal appetites, but
Yeah, I
man
think
is a
you're right.
rational being?
Yeah, you're right. I think the Christian understanding of soul will later say plants don't have a soul. They are
Mhm.
not going to die and then go to some other place. But by his definition of soul, no, they have the vegetative part. They take food in and they turn it into something else. And animals have the appetitive part, to feed and when they're hungry, etc. And then men also have the rational part. Some people now would say some animals also have a rational part.
So man would have all three aspects of that in place.
Yes.
Because yes, I had the same question that Lauren did. It kind of stopped in my tracks because I was making an assumption, see soul. I always think of the Christian aspect. So I was just really wondering where Aristotle was going with that. So, and then now he defined it. So.
Yeah, but you're right. He did it a little backwards. He gives us a definition that includes soul, but he doesn't really explain soul until a little later. Yeah. And we're back to the idea that parts of our soul we share with the plants, parts of our soul we share with the animals. But it sounds like to be an excellent man, you've got to be using the reason part of the soul, particularly. What is this business of high standards? He gives this example of a harpist, and he says, the function of a harpist is to play a harp, but the function of a harpist who has set high standards for himself is to play the harp excellently. So where does that leave us with the good of man then?
Well, he's trying to separate what, every human has. Every harpist plays the harp, but only happy harpists or good harpists achieve the high standards. So he's trying to segregate out what could be applied to the best humans or the ones that achieve happiness.
Okay.
Right.
Well, let me ask then, because maybe we don't know about harpists, but we might know about humans. Can you think of somebody or have heard of who you would say, that's my idea of an excellent human being?
Einstein.
A human being who sets high standards for themselves. Einstein? Okay.
Einstein.
Schweitzer.
Okay. So people whose activity of the soul is in conformity with excellence or virtue. And they set high standards for themselves.
Does their mastery in their professions, though, necessarily equate to them being happy?
That's a good question. Now, he talks about, and by happy, do you mean?
Aristotle's idea of happiness.
I think this is it. You're happy if you have an activity of the soul that's in conformity with excellence or virtue.
Now he makes the point that happiness is not a feeling. I don't feel great because I'm playing the cello so well.
Yeah,
People
it's an
think highly
activity.
of me.
Mm-hmm.
It's the activity itself of doing it, not thinking about it or having a feeling.
And doing it to the highest standards.
I mean, I can see the sense, say, with musicians, of the well-trained ones, and as I understand it, a harpist, for example, who has gotten beyond worrying about how the muscles do the strings. Probably for each piece, you need to start there. How do you play it? But to get to make it almost automatic. Maybe the easiest equivalent for a lot of us is keyboarding. When you know your hands are in the right place and you can jot off a whole long stretch of what you want to say without having to think of where to put each finger for each letter, is a much higher standard than just starting it out. Just being able to play the harp. Well,
and he doesn't emphasize it, but by using the harp example, he definitely evokes this idea of practice.
Yeah.
Right? That you've got to, someone in the other class is a musician, and she said, you know, the high standards are one thing, but the real difference between that harpist who can play the harp and the harpist who is an excellent harp player is practice. It's 99% practice.
Yeah.
And as you say, Norm, to the point where some things that you had to practice become automatic so that you can now work on higher level things. You know,
Right.
you've got certain things that become automatic and now you can go somewhere else. But it took hours and hours to get there.
Another level might be the difference between trying to speak a language you don't know well and speaking your native language.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you don't have to worry, what's the word, what's the ending on that verb. That's all already automatic.
Mm-hmm. Bill, you were going to say something?
I was just, music is dear to me, so I've always thought there was quite a difference between absolute technical excellence and inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
Not that is clear in Aristotle, at least to me.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry. So everything we're talking about right now as it relates to happiness, how does that, what's the connection between this and what we were talking about in chapter 7, which was self-sufficiency encompassing parents and children and friends and society and like being a part of your society and everything?
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, like, these seem like very different things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's why I'm going to ask somebody who mentioned Schweitzer. So give me an example of Schweitzer's activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. What am I seeing him do? Or pick someone closer to home so you can give me an example.
Well, actually, Schweitzer is a great example, I think, because, you know, we're talking about Albert Schweitzer, aren't we, Bill? You know, medical doctor, went missionary,
Right.
and he went to the communities of Africa. And if I remember, he was an excellent musician also, on top of it. But he served in the community. He had excellence in what he did with his, medicine. I mean, it seems like he's operating in that community, and he's self-sufficient. So yeah, I think that's a really good example, at least from my perception. I
was thinking he was very active.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and really was a strong professional organist who gave that up for something to him higher.
Okay.
I mean, he's major. He wrote a major book on Bach.
Mm.
I mean, he was really good, which also involves a public in a sense. You don't, great, wonderful musicians don't just do that so they can play for themselves at home.
Mm-hmm.
Career side, the sharing side. But he gave that up and went to Africa.
Well, and that may be why we have to use the phrase a complete life too.
Yeah.
That if you took a snapshot of Schweitzer, I don't know his life story, but let's say at 20, you would think, well, he's an excellent musician, and that's clearly going to be his gift to the world. But then it turned out to be something completely different. He took another turn. So you have to ask, well, is he still, activity of the soul in conformity with virtue? That he's just making different choices now.
Yeah.
Well, now I'm going to bring in, because there's a word that doesn't really occur in this definition, and it's got something to do with, and you enjoy doing it, right? And he asked that question earlier. He said a lot of people, when they talk about happiness, they're talking about you're having fun, you're having a good time, you're enjoying what you're doing. That's happiness. And now I'm trying to find the passage. If you find it before me, let me know. He says that will come into it for this person who's an excellent human being as well. It is later. It's chapter 8. He talks about popular views about happiness. And he says, now this isn't Aristotle, this is our translator saying that the popular views confirm his position. Because the popular view is you're smiling, you're happy, you're having a good time. That's happy. forget about conformity of the soul and, but he says, actually, if you watch the excellent human being, they are enjoying what they're doing. And let's look at that passage and ask ourselves if we really think that's true. So this is section 8, 1099a, where he says, the life of man active in this sense is also pleasant. Chris, if you're there, could you read that?
I'm here. I see 1099a. I say for a characteristic.
1099a about 10, where a paragraph that begins, the life of man.
And in the same, the life of men active.
Yep, that's the
one.
one.
The life of men active in this sense is also pleasant in itself, for the sensation of pleasure belongs to the soul. Each man derives pleasure from what he is said to love. A lover of horses from horses, a lover of the theater from plays, and in the same way, a lover of justice from just acts, and a lover of virtue in general from virtuous acts. In most men, pleasant acts conflict with one another because they are not pleasant by nature. But men who love what is noble derive pleasure from what is naturally pleasant. Actions which conform to virtue are naturally pleasant. And as a result, such actions are not only pleasant for those who love the noble, but also pleasant in themselves. The life of such men has no further need of pleasure as an added attraction, but it contains pleasure within itself. We may even go so far as to state that the man who does not enjoy performing noble actions is not a good man at all. Nobody would call a man just who does not enjoy acting justly, nor generous who does not enjoy generous actions, and so on. If this is true, actions performed in conformity with virtue are in themselves pleasant.
Okay, let's stop there and ask about that. I think we sometimes have a picture of somebody who's doing the right thing as kind of stern-faced, I'm doing my duty, it's hard, but I'm doing it, versus somebody who's just having a good time. And he says, no, the person who's acting in conformity with virtue is having a good time. They're enjoying it. Does that make sense to people?
I guess it would depend on where the highest nature is in there. If you're doing it because it will get you a promotion, that's not the highest end. If you're doing community service, you may be helping people out, but it may be part of a criminal sentence. You're not doing it because you really want to help people.
No, and that's a nice point, that you could actually have two people in the same store,
right,
doing the same quote unquote activity. One of them's there because the court told him he had to.
Right.
And the other one's there because he loves doing it. He likes working with these people. And yeah, the attitude, I think, would be obvious.
Yeah, I mean, an easy enough way to tell which one keeps sticking around. The person
when they don't have to.
is going to do his 30 days of community service and be done.
Yeah.
Or maybe that person will be converted to want to do it. Have such a rewarding time that it does become something that makes him happy.
But now I'm going to give another case, because someone brought up parenting in the other class. Their example of someone they thought was a person of doing an excellent human being was their wife. And they talked about raising kids, which is not so pleasant sometimes. Pleasant is your kid asks for a sucker and you buy him a sucker and he's happy and smiling and you're happy and smiling because you gave pleasure to your kid. But a lot of the time parenting is, no, you can't have that sucker. It's dinner in 5 minutes. And now you've got a kid who's crying and angry at you. And that's parenting too. So where's the pleasure in that? In being the good parent who holds the line, even though your kid hates you for it.
The pleasure is being a grandparent.
Okay.
And not the parent, and let the parents take care of that. So yes.
I mean, it's the longer picture.
Oh, sorry, Norm, your power went out a bit there. You're frozen.
Okay, it's the larger picture with the kids.
Okay.
It's not what's happening right now. You know why the kid can't have a sucker. And it's not because you don't like the kid or just want to be nasty. You're looking at a larger view of it. And I'm sure there are parents who are not happy
Mm-hmm.
and who didn't want to be, and various kinds of reasons, but certainly there are others who are,
Mm-hmm.
and who see what their job is and do that job well, and as much as they can be sure of it, know they're doing it well.
Mm-hmm.
And you get to see the kid grow up.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you don't know it. Maybe the ending there of that happiness is when you can deal with the kid as an adult and be more equal.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is some
Yeah,
of this,
James.
is some of this to respond to your question, some of that have to do with the sense of complete life. And you just can't take the notion at that moment when your child is driving, in my case, your kid's crazy, which I kind of chuckle at. But anyway, that, you know, it's really over the totality of time that you have to look backwards and say, was that a complete life, and I was excellent as a parent, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm now thinking a little differently because of this example about Solon's first choice for the most happy person. Do you remember? He says, "Tellus the Athenian," who of course nobody's ever heard of. He's not famous. He's not Schweitzer. He's not anybody. And Croesus says, "Well, what's so great about Tellus the Athenian?" And Solon says, and I'm going to paraphrase here. I'm not sure if I get it quite right. He was born in a democratic state, Athens. He grew up in that state. He raised children who were healthy, and I think they had children. I think that was part of it. And then he died in battle, defending that state, and they buried him on the battlefield. So he had some external honor for fighting that battle, but it sounds like part of it is also he raised his kids well. And, you know, luckily they didn't die, which he couldn't have controlled. You know, so he got to see his kids grow up, and maybe they grew up well because he didn't give them a sucker every time they wanted one. And, you know, then died well.
And he died for them.
And died, yeah, for them. Not just for the state, but for his community, including his kids. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like a perfect Greek life, you know, the way you described it. That's,
Mm-hmm.
you know, dying on the, you know, the battlefield,
Mm-hmm.
you know, honor.
Mm-hmm. But also kids who grew up and were good people. So, yeah. But now a lot of that life depended on some external things. He had no control over what state he grew up in. You know, he might have just been permanently disabled on the battlefield, had a horrible wound, and, you know, lingered for 20 years in terrible pain. That didn't happen. And Aristotle does talk about external things, because we've mostly been talking about how you control your own emotions, how you treat other people. Let's look at the part where he talks about, but there are externals that affect things too. And in fact, some people think happiness is luck. It's like having good things happen to you. Let's see if I can find the place where he talks about externals. Part of it is in chapter 10. And he's, you know, this is all about Solon. He talks about this idea of, can you call a man happy during his lifetime at all? But then towards the end, he starts talking about reverses that happen to you. And what about that? So this is around 1100 B20. A line that begins, "The happy man will have the attribute of permanence." Let's see. And I think, Bill, you haven't read yet. Would you read for us?
Looking for it.
Okay. So it's in section 10, "Can a man be called happy?" And then
Right.
about 2 pages in, 1100 B, around 15, a paragraph that begins, "The happy man."
Got you. The happy man will have the attribute of permanence, which we are discussing, and he will remain happy throughout his life. For he will always, or to the highest degree, both do and contemplate what is in conformity with virtue, He will bear the vicissitudes of fortune most nobly and with perfect decorum under all circumstances, inasmuch as he is truly good and foursquare beyond reproach. Interesting that that's a real quote.
Yeah.
But fortune brings many things to pass, some great and some small. Minor instances of good and likewise of bad luck obviously do not decisively tip the scales of life, but a number of major successes will make life more perfectly happy. For in the first place, by their very nature, they help to make life attractive. And secondly, they afford the opportunity for noble and good actions. On the other hand, frequent reverses can crush and mar supreme happiness in that they inflict pain and thwart many activities. Still, nobility shines through even in such circumstances when a man bears many great misfortunes with good grace, not because he is insensitive to pain, but because he is noble and high-minded. Continue?
One more, yeah.
If, as we said, the activities determine a man's life, no supremely happy man can ever become miserable, for he will never do what is hateful and base. For in our opinion, the man who is truly good and wise will bear with dignity whatever fortune may bring, and will always act as nobly as circumstances permit, just as a good general makes the most strategic use of the troops at his disposal, and a good shoemaker makes the best shoe he can from the leather available, and so on with experts in all other fields. If this is true, a happy man will never become miserable, but even so, supreme happiness will not be his if a fate such as Priam's befalls him. And yet he will not be fickle and changeable. He will not be dislodged from his happiness easily by any misfortune that comes along, but only by great and numerous disasters, such as will make it impossible for him to become happy again in a short time. If he recovers his happiness at all, it will be only after a long period of time in which he has won great distinctions.
Okay, let's stop there. So, he's talking about partly the popular view that happiness, and hap is in our word happiness. It's what haps to you. What happens? So you're happy if you are born in a good state, if you have health, if you marry and your wife doesn't die, the next year, your kids are born healthy. I mean, there's a lot of your happiness that is completely out of your control, according to the popular idea. And Aristotle addresses that here, but he says, yeah, a lot of those things will happen, but there's something about the excellent human being that he won't be as affected by those things as other people. Although he admits that something like Priam, maybe there's certain circumstances that can happen that there's no coming back from. Priam lived a pretty seemingly happy life. He had, I think, 50 sons. They married. They all lived with him. It all sounded great. And then his city is destroyed. His children are, murdered in front of him. And then finally he's murdered. You can't call that happy.
But Aristotle is just saying that there's resilience as part of happiness, right?
Mm-hmm. And why? What makes happiness resilient?
I thought he was saying that it was a quality of happiness that it's as if it's somehow supports itself to some degree.
Mm-hmm. So his version of happiness is not going to be, well, you're happy today because things are going well, and you're unhappy tomorrow because things are going poorly. It's somehow you keep the same, even though the fortunes go up and down.
Yeah, a different way of talking about some of that stuff once I heard was after sort of great calamity, can you live with the new now, the new reality, and accept it?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to complain about how great it used to be and now it's just horrible.
Mm-hmm.
Can Grandpa stay happy?
Yeah. Well, and now we might be back to why we need to see a long life. Because what if you have someone who, fortune has brought pretty good things to them over time. And maybe they are one of these immature people he talks about who've reached 65. are mostly ruled by their emotions, but somehow life has gone really well for them. And now things go badly. And as you're describing, that person who's, always been led by their emotions maybe doesn't have anything to rely on.
Yeah.
And now we see that what we thought was a happy person is actually someone who can't handle adversity.
Right. And I mean, with 65, I'm thinking of hearing about people who retire and just have nothing left.
Mm-hmm.
The job was everything.
Mm.
Even if there's some sense of family around, where somebody else with family still around, that's what you really want. And I can still be very happy. Now I can be happy because I can see him all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you'd have to assume that for that person, the job wasn't everything while the person was working.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Well, and let's look at the examples he gives of the shoemaker and the general. So, a good general makes the most strategic use of the troops at his disposal. Often they're not that great. I'm thinking about General Lee is often talked about as somebody who often his troops were poorly fed and had no uniforms and ragtag, but he used them really well. Or a good shoemaker who makes the best shoes he can from the leather available. So is that something that makes sense to us in terms of an excellent human being? So even if they don't have the right tools and resources, they can make something pretty good?
Play the cards you're dealt.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it suggests, I'm thinking of the shoes, that what you judge is how well the shoe is made, not how good the leather is.
Mm-hmm.
Because a bad shoemaker can really wreck a good piece of leather.
Mm-hmm.
So, and knowing that you've done a good job with what you got helps.
Mm-hmm. Now he does, with all this thinking about external circumstances, he does actually alter his definition. So let's read on and see, we get sort of a restatement now of his definition with a couple of changes. Now, Ekagra, I wonder if you can find us here. Did you see where we were reading, even in your different translation? Can you pick up on the last paragraph here?
It's still chapter 10, right?
Still chapter 10, and it's the very last paragraph of this chapter, where he says, is there anything then to prevent us from defining the happy man? And he gives a new definition. Does that look familiar?
Yes. So, okay, I'm going to say the first line. Let me know if I'm on the right track, because it's a different translation. When then should we not say that he is happy who is active in accordance with complete virtue and is sufficiently equipped with external goods, not for some chance period, but throughout a complete life?
Yep. Keep going.
Or must we add, and who is destined to live thus and die as befits his life? Certainly the future is obscure to us, while happiness, we claim, is an end and something in every way final. If so, we shall call happy those among living men in whom these conditions are and are to be fulfilled, but happy men. So much for these questions.
Okay. So
I get an enormous kick out of Aristotle always saying so much for this. just by the by.
Okay, now we're done with that. On to the next thing.
It's like a mic drop.
Mm-hmm. But now we have modified the definition of happiness to include external things and maybe also a long life. So let's look at our new definition and see if we think he ought to have included these. So now we're defining the happy man, the excellent human being, as one whose activities are an expression of complete virtue and who is sufficiently equipped with external goods, not simply at a given moment, but to the end of his life. And maybe we even need to add that he has to die well. But I thought he just said the happy man can handle even lack of shoe leather and not too many soldiers. We don't need to be sufficiently equipped. So should that be part of the definition?
It perhaps isn't. Like the key is sufficiently, maybe. So like a shoemaker has leather.
Okay.
A shoemaker with no leather, but you may not need the perfect, exquisite piece.
Okay, that's a good point. A shoemaker can do a lot with poor leather, but he can't make a shoe with no leather.
That's what I tell my students. I can't grade a paper you don't turn in. Right?
Okay. So you got to have something to work on. Maybe not as, if the more you have, the better a shoemaker is going to be, but you can't have nothing. Well, and maybe, this addresses the question Bill raised early on, that are there limits to this? If you are you're born a slave, you live a terrible life, you're whipped daily, nothing you say is honored, you know that you can't get married and have kids and keep the kids because they'll just be sold down the river. Can you really be happy? Or are you not sufficiently equipped with external goods to really be happy?
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, further, I mean, there's none of the kind of education that seems to be built into Aristotle's kind of a baseline that it seemed to me, expected for people who could really understand.
Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, just working it the other way, you could imagine a very wealthy person who's got plenty of, external goods, but because he's ruled by his passions, he can't be happy either.
He needs more goods.
Oh, real goods, you mean?
Yeah,
Virtues.
I've only got this much. I deserve more. He's never going to be happy.
You couldn't be thinking of a billionaire, could you?
What? Me? I mean, listening to some of these people that deserve their money and deserve more of it.
Well, and one way that he talks about external goods is as instruments. I want to go back to the passage where he talks about that, because it's not the way we usually talk about our friends, as instruments of doing good. This is in section 8, again, popular views, around 1099b, where he's saying happiness needs external goods. And he begins to use the word instruments. Norm, do you have it? Would you read it? Still happiness, as we have said?
Where's B? Okay.
So we're in section 8.
Okay, got it.
10. Oh, you got it. Okay.
Yeah. Still, happiness, as we have said, needs external goods as well. For it is impossible, or at least not easy, to perform noble actions if one lacks the wherewithal. Many actions can only be performed with the help of instruments, as it were, friends, wealth, and political power. And there are some external goods, the absence of which spoils supreme happiness. For example, good birth, good children, and beauty. For a man who is very ugly in appearance, or ill-born, or who lives all by himself and has no children, cannot be classified as altogether happy. Even less happy, perhaps, is a man whose children and friends are worthless, or one who has lost good children and is through death. Thus, as we have said, happiness also requires well-being of this kind, and is the reason why some classify good fortune with happiness, while others link it to virtue.
Okay. let's talk a bit about that idea of needing instruments to do good. So since for him, happiness is an action, not just an attitude, I need stuff to do my actions with. And what I need is friends, wealth, political power, maybe children, beauty, good birth. Now, Bill, it's starting to sound pretty aristocratic, right?
Yeah, I agree with Bill. The scope of who can be happy, according to that passage, is getting narrower and narrower.
Mm-hmm.
Because we just excluded a lot of the ones we talked about originally.
Mm-hmm. And he seems to really focus on children too.
But that's something that can run through a lot of, say, economic levels.
Mm-hmm.
And I would translate maybe wealth as enough.
Mm.
So you're not struggling about how the kids are going to eat. And you're certainly not in an African famine area. But you've got enough to be happy. You don't need to be, I think you don't need to be rich. Wealth is a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah. Well, and he's also hedging, he's now introduced this idea of supreme happiness.
Yeah.
So there seems to be, could you be happy with, some just a few friends, not a lot of wealth, not much political power? It sounds like he thought maybe. You cannot be supremely happy, though, if you don't have good children. Sounds like it's and which do you say is worse? Having no children is bad, but even worse is having worthless children.
Right.
But the last clause that he uses in this short section says, and that is the reason why some classify good fortune with happiness,
Mm-hmm.
while others link into virtue. And then if you jump into 9, I think it's almost like he's saying some think this.
Yeah, he's taking
this.
popular views for sure. But then he is incorporating at least some attention to externals in his final definition there. He doesn't specify them. He just says sufficiently equipped with external goods.
And then he just jumps in, starting 9, saying this also explains why there is a problem whether happiness is acquired by learning, by discipline, or for some other kind of training, or whether we can attain it by reason, some divine dispensation, or even by chance. He seems to leave that previous paragraph off, and he gets back into
Meno territory, right?
Yeah.
That should have sounded very familiar. How do you get it?
Cynthia, I took some of this as these external goods and other factors as connecting back to the whole political state. You need the polis. Self-sufficiency doesn't mean isolation. And that, going back to his original things, that how do you get wealth? How do you, children, friends, you need other people, you need your polis around you.
Mm-hmm.
A connection, at least I made when I read it.
Mm-hmm. And it's easier to see maybe when you take it to his extreme, that if it sounds like by this definition, if you're on an island, you can't be happy. You don't have friends to practice your virtue on. You don't have a community. Yeah. Lauren.
Well, what interests me about this is that there is no subjectivity whatsoever in these definitions. There's does one perceive oneself to be happy? And by external standards, you could say one has all these, therefore they're happy, and they may not be. And conversely, some who could be lacking these, there could be nevertheless their own belief in their happiness. Like those things that are lacking are not personally in any way preventing them from achieving happiness. So I don't know. We don't allow for any subjective feelings on that.
Well, and does it seem clear to you that two people could have the very same, I'm want to use this expression, external goods, and one could be happy with them and the other not?
Right. That's exactly. He seems to be sort of requiring a checklist, and I don't know that always. That's what I guess I'm asking you. If one who has all those things by definition should be happy, or one lacking them could that they nevertheless be happy?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just the external things, right? I thought the definition also included the external things, sufficient external things plus the practice of virtue.
Mm-hmm.
So if one, sorry, Bill, what did you say?
Our rational principle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if one person has more of those external things than the other, or like if they both have the same external things, but one is happier, then would Aristotle argue that, well, the happier person is probably like better at practicing virtue and rationality and everything?
Mm-hmm. Well, and back to Lauren's point too, I wonder if the person who's, the excellent person whose activity of soul is in conformity with virtue might have different judgments about what's sufficient equipment in external goods. Versus Norm, the guy you were bringing up, who has what most people would say is a lot and doesn't consider it enough and spends most of their life trying to get more.
And
I wonder though.
Yeah, Akagara, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Norm. I was gonna say, I wonder though that in both those examples, the one who's in whose subjective opinion he does not have enough, and in the other example, the rich person who's in whose subjective opinion he also does not have enough and needs more. I wonder if for both of them, Aristotle would say that the fact that their subjective opinion is that means they are not practicing virtue well, and they're not utilizing their rationality in a mature fashion, and that's why they're not happy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm bothered by, if you've lost good children and friends, you can't be happy. I think there are ways to do that. I had them. They were there. That's a start in memory to something. And why not do something else? Not so much to replace them, but anything more modern terms. Why don't you go out and tutor kids?
I mean, isn't this just another example that what we were reading before, where Aristotle was saying it up to a certain point, happiness seems to protect you from reversal, but it's maybe really extreme reversal takes time to recover from.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's a matter of degrees of happiness. Not that you can't be happy, but it'll be hard to come back from it, or you'll be less happy. Yeah. Well, and I guess I'm interested in thinking of it like, a virtuoso, that if a person of human excellence, give a really good violinist a great violin, and you're really going to hear something. Give an excellent human being lots of external stuff to do good with, and boy, are you going to see some good happen. On the other hand, if they don't have a lot of stuff to do good with, they'll still do good things. You just won't have that amazing experience of someone who really knows what they're doing playing a Stradivarius. Supreme happiness. Yeah. And that might be why you picked Schweitzer, that he's somebody who had the abilities, but also was able to get on the world stage and do something with it, and wrote and became famous, and versus, remember, Tellus the Athenian, who no one's ever heard of.
I'm thinking of the violinist and the Stradivarius. If that's something you really desire, you could be very unhappy. I would probably never have even thought of being a great violinist and playing a Stradivarius. So my things would be somewhere else. but it's not just that you're deprived of it, but maybe that you wanted to do something and it didn't work.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of good violins that are not Stradivari.
Right.
And you have to be a damn great violinist to get access to one. So it's a kind of there isn't a big market.
Right. But,
Well, and one thing we'll have to ask ourselves as we go, because he's going to go into different virtues and, how this person of, who's an excellent human will handle things. We'll have to ask how much instrumentality is needed. Is this available to most of us or to just a few of us? This version of happiness.
How much external stuff?
Yeah. And not just stuff, but instrument. I mean, he really describes it as an instrument. It's the thing that's going to help you do your actions. For generosity, you need some stuff to give to people. And if you don't have any, your generosity is not in action. So we'll have to ask about that as we go along. Now, are there other things? We haven't covered the whole chapter. We've got about 10 minutes here at the end. Are there other things that he said that you want to talk about that we maybe didn't get to? Either, other people's opinions about happiness. He does talk at one point about honor being something that people think is happiness.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that actually. Kind of, he goes between difference between praise and honor.
Yeah.
Lucky and blessed, kind of in the margins, because we were differentiating between the two in Herodotus, but we honor kind of are connected with this higher thing of being blessed. Where potential goods that I guess that's what we just talked about, the externalities, but goods that we praise, the virtues are in a different category.
Well, and it's interesting because he starts talking about eulogies in that section. So this is section 12, the praise according to happiness. And
glad you got here. I was totally lost in this.
Yeah. So he's asking, is happiness the kind of thing you praise, or is it the kind of thing you honor? And partly it because he brings up eulogies toward the end of it, it made me think of, you hear this phrase nowadays, don't live your resume, live your eulogy. Your resume is full of your praiseworthy things, that you're trying to get this job, and here's this great, I've done this great thing and that great thing. And he talks about, we like to be praised, but that perhaps with happiness, it's not about praise, it's about honor. And let's look at that. That's where he brings up eulogies. This is around line 30 in section 12. Praise is proper to virtue or excellence. Jason, would you read that?
One sec.
So it's the last paragraph of that section 12.
Sure. Praise is proper to virtue or excellence because it is excellence that makes men capable of performing noble deeds. Eulogies, on the other hand, are appropriate for achievements of the body as well as of the mind. However, a detailed analysis of the subject is perhaps rather the business of those who have made a study of eulogies. For our present purposes, we may draw the conclusion from the preceding argument that happiness is one of the goods that are worthy of honor and are final. This again seems to be due to the fact that it's a starting point or fundamental principle, since for its sake all of us do everything else. And the source and cause of all good things we consider as something worthy of honor and as divine.
Okay. So I guess I'm going to ask about this. So the person who is really a great human being, an excellent human being, he says that's a person we would not necessarily praise, but we would honor. And what's the difference?
Praise applies to things that are measured relatively. Like we praise an athlete when he wins a race. We praise, like a really good musician, I guess, going back to the music example. because you're comparing that to a reference point. You're comparing that to a less good measure, whereas happiness is like the absolute. And there is no like, it's not something that's it's not something that anything else can't be compared to it. So that's why it should be considered to be divine.
Yeah. Yeah, and he compares it to, we praise athletes, we compare them, we say, wow, you're the greatest runner. And it's all about relative, like you said, relativity. But then around 25, he says, but no one praises happiness in the same sense in which he praises justice, but he exalts its bliss as something better and more nearly divine.
Yep. My translation uses the word blessed, which also has a divine connotation to it.
Yeah.
So praise is for very limited or one-time events, essentially, and happiness is an ongoing virtue that is worthy of honor in the sense that praiseworthy things are not. I made a hash of that.
Yeah, yeah. And it's divine, maybe because of that.
Because of what?
Because
whenever he talks about divine, I have this blinker that goes on.
Yeah. So to work really hard and become a good racer, I'm just using his analogies here, deserves praise. I say you raced better than everybody else in that race. Versus what you said is that happiness, the way he defines it, is a long life. You've done this for a long time. You didn't get ready for one race. You are consistently, even ups and downs of fortune, you're still the excellent person. And he says that should be honored. That's not compared to, that's sort of an absolute of a kind, almost divine. Like someone who can be that way all the time is godlike in a sense.
Did we use permanent versus point in time?
Yeah, maybe.
Happy is it's a state, like he's defined it as you've reached the end of your life and you can look back and you're externally happy. Versus praise is a point in time, like you're a fast person who won some races, but it's very tied to a performance or a state at a given time. Versus your objectively whole life in sum is happy.
Yeah.
Wondering with the terms, you can praise somebody who is not at your level. I mean, we praise kids and praise, maybe we don't think of the violinist as quite that much. We honor somebody who in a sense is above us, who has done more than we can.
And maybe we try to emulate them too.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a piece of honor, is I praise a great runner, but I'm not a great runner and I'm not going to be one. Right. I think it's great you are, but I honor somebody who, I hope to emulate in some way.
Right. Or who has really done something. We can honor somebody who's been of great service.
Yeah.
Can also praise them, but it's different.
Yeah.
I just wonder if praise needs the person as the audience. Certainly with kids. I don't know. But
you mean someone who is praised?
Yeah, you need someone there to praise, which is hard to do when the person is dead.
That's the relativity that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece of that, I'm thinking now back to Tellus the Athenian, that it was an unusual honor to be buried on the battlefield. That only happened if you had really died well. And he's not there to hear that, to
Right.
understand that honor, but his family is.
Yeah.
And that's different from praise too.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so for next week, we're kind of at the end here. We're pretty much going to do a book a week, except there's going to be there's 2 books on the subject of friendship. So when we hit those, we'll read 2 at once. So for next week, we're looking at book 2, and it's all about habit. So we're back to how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, 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 and that's his attitude about virtue and happiness. You got to work at it.
Or take a taxi.
Yes. Okay, so I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.